made to walk behind the wagon like a dog. A Lakota chief lifted her onto his horse beside him. The rope wasn't long, maybe 8 feet of it, tied at the tailgate of a Conestoga with a knot I could see from 200 yards, the kind of knot a man ties when he doesn't want whatever's on the end to get any slack at all. I was up on the ridge watching the wagon train move through the valley, the way I always watch things move through that valley, and it took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. There were 11 wagons. They moved like they always moved through hung papa land, slow, heavy, churning the grass to dust, the oxen pulling with their heads down and their necks straining. My scout, 2 Kills, was beside me. He said nothing. He'd seen it the same moment I had. A woman was attached to that rope. Not tied rough, not bleeding, not being dragged, just walking behind the wagon like an animal they'd tied to keep from losing it, walking in the wheel ruts and the kicked-up grit with her head down and her dress gray from the road. I watched her for a while. She kept pace. She didn't stumble, didn't pull, didn't try to get free. She'd learned that much, I supposed. I am catches the wind. I have been called other things by other men. By the army I was given a name they wrote in their ledgers. By my enemies I was called other things, none of which I'll repeat here. By my people I am what I am, a man who led the hung papa Lakota through the hardest years I can remember, who buried more than I care to count, who made decisions that kept more alive than they killed. That's all a chief is in the end. A man who decides and carries what those decisions cost. I was 53 years old that summer. Not old for a white man maybe, but I had spent those 53 years harder than most men spend 100. I had a scar along my left ribs from an Arikara lance I took at 22. A bad knee from a fall off a horse in the dark. I had 2 daughters and a son, and I had buried a wife, and I had been the one to close her eyes, and I carried that the way a man carries a stone in his chest, something you stop noticing most days until you don't. I tell you this so you understand who was sitting on that ridge. Not a young man with a young man's fire. Not a man looking for trouble. A tired man, careful, measuring everything he saw and asking what it was going to cost him. I watched that woman walk behind the wagon for a long time. 2 Kills said quietly, "She is Lakota." I had already seen it. The way she held herself even in the ruts. The line of her cheekbones when she lifted her head for a moment, just a moment, and looked at the hills the way a person looks at something they know. Not like a white woman looking at wild country, like a woman looking at home. I said half. 2 Kills looked again, he nodded, half he agreed. That was all we said about it. I turned my horse and rode back down the ridge. I want to be careful here, because there are men who would tell this story differently. They would make it larger than it was, or they would make it simpler, and neither would be honest. I was not moved by what the white men call chivalry. I don't know that word well, but I know what it means, the idea that a man acts for a woman because she is small and needs protecting. That was not it. What I felt, watching that woman in the wheel ruts, was something older and harder than that. There is a word my grandfather used, wikazani. It means something like the right order of things, the way the world is supposed to sit. And when you see the order broken, when you see something in the world that has been turned against itself, there is a thing that moves in a man, not heat, not anger, something quieter and more settled than that. A knowing, this is wrong, this will not stand. I had that knowing, watching her walk on that rope behind that wagon. I did not go riding down immediately. I am not a young man who acts on what he feels. I went back to our camp and I sat with it through the rest of that morning, eating, tending to my horse, speaking with my sub-chief Tall Pine about the bison we'd tracked east of the creek, living the day, letting the knowing sit in me and find its proper shape. By midday I knew what I was going to do. I called 2 Kills and 4 others. Good men, Crow Dog, who was young and steady, Hawk Runs, who was older than me and had forgotten more about horses than I would ever know, Little Thunder, who was Crow Dog's uncle and built like a door, and a young man named Beartooth who had something to prove, and I brought him so he could prove it where I could watch. We rode to the valley. The wagon train had made camp near the creek for the midday rest. 11 wagons in a rough circle, fires being built, women working, children running. Ordinary enough, except that the woman on the rope had been staked to the wagon wheel. She was sitting in the dirt with her back against the wheel and her wrists in her lap, and she was eating something, a piece of hardtack, I think, or biscuit, and she was eating slowly and carefully, the way a person eats when they've learned to eat everything they're given because they don't know when more is coming. I rode in with my 5 men around me, and I did not hurry and I did not make a show of slowing down. I rode at an easy walk, because a man who rides easy into another man's camp is saying something about how things stand. He is saying, I am not afraid of what you have here, and I am not impressed by it, and we will talk like men who understand each other. The wagon train had a leader, they always do. A large man with red in his beard and a felt hat that had been black once. He came out to meet us with 3 other men behind him, and he had a rifle in the crook of his arm, not raised, just present, the way a man holds a rifle when he wants you to know he has one. I spoke English when I needed to. I said, I would like to know about the woman at the wagon wheel. He said she was his property. He said it plain, without apology, the way a man says a word he has said so many times it has lost all its edges. She was his property. He had papers. She was a slave, and the law of the land allowed for it, and he was a man who followed the law. I looked at the papers he produced. I held them in my hands and looked at them. I cannot tell you what the papers said because I have never been a strong reader of the white man's writing, but I held them and looked at them and I handed them back, and I said, calmly, these papers do not travel well into Hung Papa land. His eyes changed, not afraid, not yet, recalculating. I said, I would like to discuss this with you. He said there was nothing to discuss. I nodded. I sat on my horse above him and I thought about that, and then I said, you are on Hung Papa land. You have been on it for 3 days. You are going to be on it for 4 more. I know every creek you will camp at and every rise you will cross. I know whether your oxen get water or don't. He was quiet for a while after that. I said, I am asking for a discussion. That is a simple thing for a reasonable man. He took a breath. He said he would listen. What I told him was this. I had no argument with his wagon train. His people could pass through and I would not trouble them. I asked for the woman. I said I would give him 3 horses in exchange, good horses, better than the animal he had tied to that wheel. I said this was a fair exchange, and that I was not a man who made unfair exchanges. He said the woman was worth more than 3 horses. I said I would give him 5. He thought about it. I watched him think. There was the money value of her, whatever value a man like that put on a life, and there was the calculation of whether he wanted to travel 4 more days through our land with a Hung Papa chief who had offered him 5 horses and been refused. He said yes. I had one of my men cut the rope from the wagon wheel. She stood up slowly, the way a person stands when their joints have been ground down by months of hard use. She was maybe 30, maybe a little past. She had her mother's face, Lakota, no question, and her father's height, and her eyes were the color of creek mud in spring, that particular warm brown that changes with the light. She stood in the dirt and looked at me, and she didn't say anything. I said in Lakota, do you understand me? She said in Lakota, a little rough, a little unpracticed, but there, yes. I reached down and I took her wrist, not rough, just a grip enough to anchor, and she put her foot on my moccasin and her other hand on my forearm, and she came up behind me on the horse. And that was that. I felt the 5 men behind me settle, not surprise, something else, a recognition maybe, the way men recognize when a thing that was wrong has been corrected. We rode out of that camp at the same easy walk I'd ridden in at. Her name was Winona. Her mother had been Hung Papa, taken by a trader when she was young, and the trader had been her father in the way that such things went, and he had raised her in a settlement east of the Missouri with white schooling and Lakota cooking, and a confusion between those two things that never resolved. Her mother had died when Winona was 12. Her father had died 5 years later, and then the questions of what she was and who owned her had been settled by men with papers, and the papers said she was property, and that was what she had been for 8 years. 8 years? I had no way to measure what 8 years of that did to a person. I could only see what was left, a woman who moved carefully, who ate what she was given, who spoke quietly and waited to be spoken to, who had these eyes that were always a little bit ahead of the moment, reading what was coming before it arrived. A woman who had learned, very thoroughly, how to survive. She slept in my daughter's tent the first night. My daughter Swallow, she was 19 then, she took one look at Winona and brought her a blanket and food without being asked. That's the kind of woman Swallow was. She didn't need me to tell her what was needed. I went to bed that night with the knowing still in my chest, but quieter now, more settled. What happened next I did not expect. Not any of it. In the morning Winona came to me and she asked what she could do. She said it plainly, standing in the early light with her hands loose at her sides. She said, "I don't know what you want from me or what is expected. I would like to know so I can do it correctly." There was something in that, the directness of it, the steadiness, that I hadn't been prepared for. I'd expected grief or fear or the particular blankness I'd seen in her eyes at the wagon wheel. I got something else. I got a woman asking a direct question and waiting for a direct answer. I told her she wasn't expected to do anything. She was free. She could stay among us or she could go to the settlement at Bear Creek, 2 days east, where there were mixed-blood people who might know her family. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I haven't been free in 8 years. I don't entirely know what that means yet." I said, "It means you decide what to do with the morning." She thought about that. Then she said, "Then I'll cook. I'm a good cook." And she walked over to the fire and she started cooking. And she was right, she was good. I want to say I was watching her out of kindness, out of some chief's obligation to people who came into his camp. I want to say it was that simple, and for a while, for the first few days, I told myself it was. But I am 53 years old and I have lived long enough to know when I am not being honest with myself. And by the end of that first week, I was not being honest with myself. I watched her. I watched the way she crouched by the fire in the morning, not delicate, not performing anything, just working the set of her shoulders, the way she managed the coals, the smell of the fat and the dried corn she used. I watched the way she talked to my daughter Swallow, slowly at first, then with more ease, then with laughter, quiet laughter, the kind that seems like it surprised the person doing it. I watched the way she was with my youngest daughter, Red Wing, who was 12 and curious about everything. Winona let her ask questions, all of them, and answered them plainly, and never made her feel foolish. I watched the way she sat in the evening when the work was done, the way she looked at the hills. I had not watched a woman that way since I buried my wife. And I was ashamed of it, not because it was wrong, but because I hadn't expected it, and a man doesn't like to be caught off guard by his own heart. I was a chief. I was a man with responsibilities and grief and a bad knee and a stone in my chest where my wife used to be. I was not a man who should be sitting by the fire in the evening looking at the way a woman watched the hills. But I was. She stayed. 2 weeks went by and then 3, and she stayed. She took over a portion of the cooking from the women who'd been doing it, not pushing them aside, but finding her place alongside them, useful, steady. She began to learn again. Her Lakota came back in pieces, a word at a time, phrases her mother had taught her surfacing like things that had been pressed underwater and were finally being allowed to rise. She rode one of my horses. She rode well, another thing her father had given her. And she went with the women when they gathered roots, and she learned which plants she didn't know. She was finding her footing. That's the only way I know to say it. She was a woman who'd had the ground cut out from under her for 8 years, and she was learning to stand again. And there was a particular quality to the watching of that, a particular kind of I don't know the word. Not pride. Not yet. Something quieter. The satisfaction of seeing a thing become what it was meant to be. I did not speak to her about anything personal. About myself, I mean. I spoke to her about the land, about the camp, about what was needed and what would happen next. Chief's business. I told myself that was the appropriate distance, and I maintained it. She didn't make it easy. Not because she pushed. She didn't push. She was not a woman who pushed. She noticed things. Small things. The way I favored my left leg after a long ride. She began to leave a poultice near my tent in the mornings, the same herb tallow preparation my wife had used, and she never mentioned it, just left it there. When I came back from a hard council meeting with my sub-chiefs, meeting where we'd argued for 4 hours about whether to move the winter camp north or south, she brought food without being asked and set it near me and went away, not making a production of it. Just seeing what was needed and providing it. One evening she was sitting near the fire and I came and sat near her, and neither of us spoke for a long time, and it was comfortable. That was the thing that caught me, the comfort of it, the ease. I could not remember the last time, sitting near another person, had felt that easy. I said finally, "How are you sleeping?" She said, "Better than I have in years." I nodded. I said, "The nightmares will come less." She looked at me. She said, "You know about nightmares?" I said I did. She said, "What do you do with them?" I thought about it. Then I said, "I tell them they are from the past. I tell them the past doesn't own the morning." She was quiet with that for a while. Then she said softly, "I'm going to try to remember that." We sat until the fire burned low, and then we went to our separate places, and I lay in the dark, and I thought about the way the firelight had sat in her eyes, and I told myself to stop thinking about it, and I did not stop thinking about it. What I have not told you yet is what happened in the 4th week. There was a party of men, 6 of them, American Army and 2 hired scouts, who came into the valley on a Thursday. I know it was Thursday because Swallow had been counting days toward the new moon, and she told me. 6 men looking for a woman who'd gone missing from a wagon train. I did not need them to describe the woman. I went out to meet them with Crow Dog and Hawk Runs and Little Thunder. The army man in charge, a lieutenant, young, the kind of young that thinks it's hiding behind authority, he said they were looking for a woman, half-breed, who'd been taken from a wagon party. He described her. He had papers, of course. Always papers. I said, "There is no woman here who was taken against her will." He said his information indicated otherwise. I held his eyes. I said, "Your information is incorrect." He said he would need to search the camp. Little Thunder shifted his horse a foot to the left. A small thing. Hawk Runs did nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Hawk Runs was a man who did nothing when nothing needed doing, and everything when it did. Crow Dog was just watching, still as a stone, which is what Crow Dog did when he was very ready. The lieutenant reconsidered. He said he would require documentation of any exchange that took place with the wagon party. I told him I didn't keep documentation of horse trades. I asked if he would like to ride back east and ask the man with red in his beard. I said the man seemed fond of papers. The lieutenant left. He didn't like leaving, but he left. I turned my horse and rode back into camp, and I did not look for Winona. I did not want her to think she needed to thank me for anything. What I had done was not something that required thanks. It was the right order of things. But she found me later, when I was tending my horse in the evening. She came and stood near me, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I heard what happened." I said nothing happened. She said, "You protected me." I said, "I told the truth. No one here was taken against their will." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "Catches the wind." Something about the way she said my name. She had never said my name before. She'd said Chief, or she'd found ways to speak to me without using a name at all, which I hadn't noticed until now. She said, "I know I'm not your obligation. I know you bought me out of that and it didn't make me yours and you never treated me like I was. I know that, but I want to say something." I finished what I was doing with the horse. I turned to look at her. She said, "I want to stay, not because I don't have anywhere to go. I've been to Bear Creek in my head 100 times this month. I know I could go. I want to stay because this is the first place I've been in 8 years where someone looked at me and saw a person. And that was you. Before anyone else, before the women, before Swallow, that was you on that ridge looking at what was wrong and deciding to fix it." I said nothing. She took one step toward me. She put her hand flat against my chest, just her palm, just the warmth of it, and she said, "You are a man worth staying near." I stood there with that for a moment, the warmth of her hand through my shirt, the weight of what she'd said. I covered her hand with mine, held it there. I said, "Then stay. There's a thing I should tell you about being a chief among the Lakota in those years. It wasn't what the white men thought. They saw a man on a horse, a man with authority, a man who was followed. They didn't see what it cost. They didn't see the nights spent going over bad decisions, the men buried who might have been saved with a different choice, the weight of being the one who decided. They didn't see the loneliness of it, the particular loneliness of a man who leads, where everyone looks to him and no one sees him. My wife had seen me. That was what I missed most about her. Not just her presence, not just the practical weight of her in my life, though I missed that too. I missed being seen, being known. The way she could look at me across a fire and understand what kind of day it had been without me saying a word. I had not thought I would have that again. I had decided, sometime around the 2nd year after her death, that I would not have that again. Not that I'd given up on it. I don't think I was dramatic about it. I just quietly put it away. There was work to do, and my children needed what I had to give, and there was not room in a chief's life for grief about loneliness, and so I had simply set that part of myself on a shelf and left it there. And then a woman walked behind a wagon in wheel ruts, and I sat on a ridge and watched, and something woke up in me that I hadn't planned on. She moved into a tent beside mine in the 5th week. Not my tent, beside it. That was her choosing, and I want to be clear about that. Nothing happened quickly. Nothing was pushed or assumed. She chose where she was, and she chose carefully, and I respected the choosing because that was the kind of man I was, or tried to be. What happened slowly was this. We began to talk in the evenings. Not about anything large, about the day, about what she'd noticed, about things the children had said. She was funny in a way I hadn't expected. She had a dry, quiet way of making observations that caught me off guard sometimes, and I would laugh, which was something I did not do as often as I once had. My daughter Swallow noticed this. I caught her watching us one evening with an expression I recognized, the expression of a young person watching something between older people and deciding whether to be glad about it or alarmed. She settled on glad. I know this because she started finding reasons to be elsewhere in the evenings, which was the most loving thing she could have done. In the 6th week, I told Winona about my wife. Her name had been Morning Cloud, and she had died of a fever 3 years ago, and the fever had taken her quickly, 4 days from well to gone, and I had sat with her through all 4 days and had not been able to make it stop, and that was the thing I carried, not the grief, or not only the grief, but the helplessness of it. The particular powerlessness of a man who protected everything he could reach and could not reach this. Winona listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "She knew you were there. Through all 4 days, she knew." I said, "You can't know that." She said, "No, but I believe it, and I think you should too." I sat with that. I said after a while, "What about you? What do you carry?" She was quiet for a long time. Then she told me about her mother. About her father, who was not a cruel man but who did not know how to protect what he loved and had ultimately failed to do it. About the 8 years, which she did not describe in detail, she said, "There are parts of it I'm not ready to speak out loud yet. Maybe someday." I said, "Someday then." She looked at me. Something shifted in her face, not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it, like a breath let out that had been held for too long. I asked her to marry me in the 8th week. I did not do it dramatically. I am not a dramatic man. I did it the way I did most things. I thought about it for a long time first. I was sure of it, and then I said it plainly. I said, "I would like you to be my wife. If you want that." She looked at me for a long moment. The firelight was doing what it did in the evenings, moving over everything, making nothing certain. She said, "I want it." I said, "Then it's settled." She smiled at that. A real smile, not the small, careful ones I'd seen in the early weeks, but a full one, the kind that changed her whole face. She said, "Just like that." I said, "How else?" She laughed. That quiet, surprised laugh that I had come to, I don't know the right word. Require, maybe. Come to need the way you need certain things in a day, food or water, or the particular quality of early morning light. She came and sat beside me close, her shoulder against my arm, and she looked out at the dark prairie, and I looked at the same dark, and we sat there together. And there was nothing that needed to be said, and so neither of us said anything. My son, Black Horse, was skeptical at first. He was 26 and he was a cautious young man, which I had raised him to be, and caution in a young man sometimes looks like distance. He watched Winona the way a man watches something he's not sure of yet, evaluating. Not unfriendly, just careful. What broke it open was horses. Winona had learned to ride from her father, I've said that, and she rode with confidence. And one afternoon Black Horse saw her handle a horse that had been giving us trouble, a young roan with too much spirit and not enough sense, and the way she handled it was right, firm without cruelty. She spoke to the horse and she didn't expect it to listen right away, and she was patient about it. Black Horse stood and watched, and when she'd gotten the animal calm, he said something to her, a comment about her seat, a technical observation about where she was putting her weight. And she considered it and said he was right and adjusted, and they talked about the horse for half an hour, and after that they were fine. Red Wing, my youngest, had been fine from the beginning. She followed Winona around like a shadow, asking questions about everything, about the settlement where Winona had grown up, about white people's ways, about her mother's people, about the world east of the river. Winona answered patiently and honestly, including the parts that were hard. She did not make the world smaller and simpler to protect Red Wing from it. She told the truth and let my daughter sit with it, and I thought that was exactly the right thing to do. Swallow, who had been right from the start, Swallow was the one who helped Winona with the ceremony preparations. I don't know what they talked about during those preparations. It was not my business to know. But I would see them together in the afternoons, working, talking, and I would feel something in my chest that was different from the stone, something that made room beside the stone. We were married at the end of that summer in the way of my people. It was a quiet ceremony, not large. The people who needed to be there were there. At the end of it, when the ceremony was done and we were standing together in the early evening light, the prairie gold with the low sun, the grasses moving, a hawk somewhere overhead, Winona put her hand in mine and looked up at me. Her eyes had changed since the day at the wagon wheel. Not softer, she had always had something soft in her, I think, that the years had tried to press out. More open, maybe, more present. The wariness still there, but sitting further back, no longer running the whole show. She said, quietly, so only I could hear, "You are the first man in my life who decided I was worth something before I could prove it to him." I held her hand in both of mine. I said, "A man should be able to see worth without a proof being made." She said, "Not all of them can." I said, "No." We stood like that for a while, the hawk somewhere, the grasses moving. The light going the way it goes in late summer, slow and warm and not quite wanting to leave. What I felt, and I am an old man now telling you this, older than 53, old enough that I don't perform things I don't feel. What I felt was the stone in my chest still there. Morning cloud still in there, and she always will be. But something next to it. Something warm and solid and mine. A woman who had been walked in the dirt finding her footing and choosing where to stand, and choosing to stand beside me. A man doesn't always know what he's worth. He thinks he does, maybe. He has some idea. But there is a particular kind of knowing that only comes when a good woman, a woman with her own strength and her own will and her own reasons, looks at him and decides he is worth staying near. That is a different knowing, deeper than what you tell yourself. I have one more thing to tell you, and then I'm done. In the spring of the next year, a rider came from Bear Creek. He brought a message for Winona. Some distant relation had been found, a cousin of her mother's, an old woman living in the settlement who had heard there was a woman among the hung papa who might be her blood. The old woman wanted to know if this was true. Winona sat with that message for 2 days. She didn't say much about it. On the evening of the second day she came to me and she said, "I'm going to write back and tell her yes, and ask if I can come to meet her." I said, "Good." She said, "Will you come with me?" I said, "If you want me there." She said, "I want you there." I said, "Then I'll come." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I've been thinking about what I am, what I've been called. What I don't have a name for anymore because I'm not one thing or the other, and I never have been, and I spent a long time thinking that was a wound." I said, "And now?" She said, "And now I think it's just what I am, 2 things, both of them mine." I looked at her, I said, "That sounds right to me." She smiled that smile again, the full one, the one that changed her face. She said, "You know what I think? I think you see things clearly. I think that's what you are." I thought about that. I turned it over. Then I said, "Maybe. Or maybe I just knew what I was looking at when I saw it." She reached up and put her hand on the side of my face, her palm flat against my cheek, warm, steady. She looked at me the way she looked at the hills in the evening, like something she knew. Like something she recognized. I put my hand over hers and held it there. Outside, the wind was moving through the grass the way it always does on the plains, low and long and not in any hurry. The fire was low. My daughters were somewhere, living their lives. Black Horse was somewhere, probably with that roan horse he decided was his project. And I was here. A man who had sat on a ridge and seen something wrong in the world and decided he would correct it. Not because someone told him to, not because it was required of him, but because the wrong order of things could not stand. A man who had done that, and in the doing of it found something he hadn't thought to look for. A good woman's hand on his face. Her eyes knowing him. The wind moving through the grass. That's where I'll leave it.